everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore, joined by James Lanthier, CEO of Mindset Pharma. How are you doing today, James?
Great, Joe. Nice to see you again. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Excited to dig in here. I guess a little bit of a high level for our audience about kind of the main focus of Mindset Pharma. Could you give us kind of a high level, and then we'll dig into you as an individual?
Yeah, sure. So Mindset is a roughly 3-year-old biotechnology company that has been exclusively focused since it was founded on trying to discover and develop new psychedelic drugs to be used as medications. So we generally refer to them as next generation psychedelic drugs. Really, what we're trying to do is optimize on some of the characteristics of first generation drugs like psilocybin, DMT, 5-MeO DMT to try to make drugs that are going to be, safer, have a more convenient or just a more predictable duration, and can generally, work better as medications for big patient groups.
Hmm. And now with this title, Next Generation,
Yeah.
I've always been a little perplexed, but I kind of get it. So we have all these classical molecules, right? But we have to have proprietary molecules to be able to fund clinical trials. That's how I see it, at least. And is that fair? Or you did say improvements too. So you'll actually look for maybe it's more predictable or safer, comfortable, whatever. Is that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think our view is that the classical molecules or first generation, they do a good enough job that, based on all the data that's come out so far, that I think you need to aim for some improvements or modifications. I don't really think patentability alone is going to be enough to support a new molecule, commercially. That's been what we've tried to do from the very beginning is to try to change them in a way that elicits some improvements.
Right. And there's this fun thing I think the FDA does is it requires new drugs to perform better typically than existing treatments, right? So you also have to have that kind of performance edge based on like the
Well, yeah, and even for patentability, you typically need to have data. You can't simply identify a new structure and try to patent it without some argument for why there's some value to it. So I completely understand the sensitivities, in this and the arguments and concerns around, companies trying to patent, naturally occurring molecules, natural products, trying to patent, therapeutic models that are sort of at the periphery or fairly generic. So I totally get why it's a question folks gravitate towards, but we've always aimed for not only novelty in the underlying molecule, but some improvement, and our scientific team was of the view from the beginning that there probably were opportunities to improve on the drugs. And I think based on the data that it's still early, but based on the data that we've been able to generate so far, I think it very much supports that argument that that in you can make some improvements in the new molecules.
right. Absolutely. So before we go down that rabbit hole, let's kind of talk about you. So kind of curious how psychedelics came across your plate, especially from a business point of view, but maybe anything you want to share personally or otherwise about how you came to join Mindset.
Absolutely. So I'd always been really interested in psychedelic drugs, and from a generalist standpoint, and I was, aware of the research that and the evidence that was building behind them. And when I first learned about mindset, I had helped some friends get a really interesting business off the ground that was a business that applied machine learning to human fertility, and was having a lot of fun with that. But some of the original founders and seed investors behind Mindset approached me about getting involved. And I'm based in Toronto, Canada, where there was a huge amount of cannabis startup activity, and I frankly never was all that interested in. I couldn't make myself passionate about cannabis. Cannabis is totally fine, but I don't really have a relationship with it one way or the other. But I had a different relationship with psychedelics. And when I first found out about mindset, honestly, if the business plan had been just selling psychedelic umbrellas, I would have been really interested and wanted to take a good hard look at it. But when I met the scientific team and got to understand their vision for where they wanted to take mindset and where they wanted to focus mindset, and as well, really their backgrounds and how those backgrounds perfectly intersected with what we were trying to do, with what they were trying to do. I thought this is really the timing is right, and the people are right, and the plan is right. And if you have those three things, you can go really, really far. So I was really, excited to get involved.
That's awesome. I I might start selling psychedelic umbrellas.
It's never
That's
too
great.
late.
So yeah, the scene in Canada is pretty interesting. Toronto specifically, there's just so much activity happening in psychedelics and cannabis that it's got to be a little daunting. Um, and
Well,
you
yeah.
know, yeah, maybe particularly with psychedelics and biotech, it's like such an interesting kind of scene. Can you kind of describe this activity to listeners? Like what was happening up there, like in the last couple years, related to psychedelics?
Yeah, well, when I first started, yeah, getting deeper into mindset, and that was sort of late 2019. There were a handful of companies out there that had psychedelic companies that had a profile, and then it seemed like within about 6 months. That number just grew, geometrically at a huge rate. And it seemed like every other day you were getting forwarded a new pitch deck, and they all looked very similar. They all had this, shock and awe slide where they talked about, the mental health crisis and the preliminary data with psilocybin. And most of these companies were focused on a lot of them at first had sort of business plans that seemed like they were taken right out of a cannabis pitch deck, or they had just really easy to understand business plans. And it easy to understand in a way that suggested that maybe they were just a bit too easy, and it was hard to see what was going to be defensible or sustainable. And it actually was it meant that it was a bit challenging for us. We had raised some capital, but we were still interested in getting our name out there into the conversation. And it made it a bit challenging for us because Canada doesn't really have a huge biotech investing community. It does have a very, active small cap, public company investor universe that are more generalists. And so we would go to a lot of meetings where we would explain why new drugs were, potentially really important, and why it was going to be hard to create a lot of value for a for-profit business in psilocybin because it's in the public domain, and there's already one company that's done a huge amount of work in trying to lock up IP around it. So we actually had a hard time getting a lot of traction early on, because we're pitching the idea of creating something totally new. And I even had some fairly well-known psychedelic investors say to me, oh, well, you're just building a better mousetrap. And my reaction was, well, like that this is just that's the march of science. That's what science is trying to do. You're trying, you take the example of what the German scientists did in the 19th century to go from the bark of the willow tree, eventually going through a whole bunch of intermediate chemical steps to eventually get to aspirin. Like, science hopefully tries to make things better, and that's what we're trying to do. But again, it was not everybody got it at first, and fortunately we were able to advance the programs and start sharing data, and the whole the wider investor universe, I think, got more up to speed about what was important in the space, and a wider range of investors, started coming into the space. So it worked out. And I think, in fact, it was, in hindsight, it was kind of an advantage to Mindset that groups early on who were in the space weren't focused on, new drugs, because it meant that Mindset really had an opportunity to carve out a really strong intellectual property, position for ourselves by getting our patents filed before, most other groups in the space. So it all kind of, worked out in the end. But definitely the early rush of companies to the public markets, very kind of Canadian thing.
Yeah, it was definitely fascinating to watch. Certainly it was at a distance because I wasn't sure what to do with it all. Yeah. And I'm still, I'm becoming more comfortable with it because, like, as you say, this is how science works, especially when federal governments don't want to fund science to the degree we want to. Have you had any frustration around that? Like, just not having the kind of support by institutions or kind of governments worldwide, compared to maybe how like a fertility science might get funding, or like different kinds of research is funded by higher level governments?
I don't think it hasn't really been an issue for Mindset. Realistically, what we're trying to do is build build on the backs of what others have done. So this isn't, and that's why we thought there was such an opportunity here, is compared to, take another, subset of biotech. We're not trying to identify a totally new target or a new effect. We're dealing with molecules that already there's a lot of, formal and informal evidence that they have, efficacy. So we're not as reliant on, truly hard, like fundamental research, hard science. We're just trying to create, we're trying to build a better mousetrap.
I love it. So let's talk about that. Like 5-MeO DMT in particular, I think could be a good one to discuss since it's so, popular right now.
Yeah.
So, what what kind of provisional evidence were you seeing, or informal evidence or formal evidence around 5-MeO-DMT that made it look like something you wanted to investigate for? I actually don't even know what indication you're looking at for it.
Well, and we haven't settled on one. You know,
Okay.
Mindset's focus really is, and what we're really good at in is the preclinical early stage, development. And this is when I going back to kind of the theme of trying to, there's lots of others out there. Lots of others. There's others out there who have 5-MeO DMT in early stage, clinical trials, and are starting to, try to gather data, and most of those trials, I believe, are focused on sort of similar indications to psilocybin. So depression, treatment resistant depression. We're in all respects with mindset, we're trying it as much as possible not to reinvent the wheel. So, let those groups across every classic molecule do the work to establish that those molecules have some efficacy. We thought that DMT and 5-MeO DMT would be an interesting place to go next after psilocybin, because it was the molecule. It was kind of the class of drugs that was starting to get the most, interest was starting to build in. I think mainly because of the short duration. It, the duration question is really interesting, because if you talk to, it's fairly straightforward when you talk to psychiatrists. They are interested in, they think, the ones we talk to, they tend to be quite positive about psilocybin, but the duration issue is definitely seen to be, an impediment to them moving forward with it. It's just they run their own businesses, and they are looking for, throughput, and reality is, we don't know if a short duration drug is going to work as well as a longer duration drug. There's a lot of evidence about psilocybin and the existing psilocybin trip duration. We just, there's so much more work that needs to be done in the space, so much clinical work to really establish what, the right parameters are for all these different indications. And we think we're just at the early days. The space is still in the early days of that. So the bias that we have is that we think, as more and more of that work gets done, there'll be, I think there'll be, it will become increasingly personalized. So some drugs will work better for some people, for some indications. Different durations will work better for different groups of people within different indications. Really, the overarching mindset goal is to try to, design as many drugs that fit as many differentiated parameters as possible to meet the needs of this, future that we're very hopeful about, where the, clinician researchers have figured out what exactly they want in psychedelic medication.
Do you recall, or did this ever come across your radar at the 2017 MAPS conference in Oakland, California? Dr. Stanislav Grof saying 5-MeO DMT is the future of psychiatry.
I'm not sure that I'm aware of that quote. Wow.
I think it was the keynote, like the opening plenary for the whole conference. I was like, that's kind of a bold claim, but
Yeah.
I kind of understand what he's saying, because if we're dealing with psychiatry, they're kind of like tight appointment criteria. Is like 50 minutes is like on the very long end for a psychiatric visit. It's probably more like 5-10 minutes, right? Yeah. So who knows? Perhaps. I don't want to be kind of over the moon optimistic, because I've observed some sketchy things, but it's I think largely because it's uncontrolled. Like I'm sure you know this part. The Sonoran Desert toad is like plus minus 20-30%
Yeah.
potency. That's not really great when you're dealing with medicine, right?
No, not great at all. And that is, a great example of why, the natural product, so to speak, if you can call it that, doesn't really fit within the regulated, medical framework. You know, as much as anything else in the medicine beyond safety, you need as much predictability as possible. So, um, yeah, the short duration, question is really interesting. Like there's obviously, if you kind of survey the market, there's lots and lots of groups who talk about it, and even within Mindset, our collaboration with Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, is really centered on Mindset's shorter acting drug families. So, yeah, time will tell.
So what are the major categories you're looking at right now? I know there's psilocybin, 5-MeO DMT. Are there other like kind of bigger categories?
So our work really started with making structural changes to the psilocybin backbone, and out of that work, we were able to identify what we talk publicly about, really sort of three differentiated families, and then we've also then we applied a bunch of those different design strategies to DMT and 5-MeO DMT. In that family, which we call family four, it now keeps growing. We're working on additional families, and I can't say much about them, but we are starting to move beyond tryptamines, and into some, I think, even more interesting it places where we're still seeing at least in early results, a strong psychedelic effect. um, Quite a number of our families leverage this. We call it our platform technology, although that sounds like a software program. It's a chemical design strategy that we've identified, and it's a commonality between a lot of our leads, where we essentially, it's a known compound that's amplifies the effect of psychedelics in every instance that we've applied it. So hopefully in the next little bit we'll be able to talk more about it, but we think it's really interesting.
There is this yeah, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I remember this one compound that I think Sasha Shulgin put out. It was like 2CN or maybe something like that. It's like he called it a psychedelic tofu. And it's reminding me of that a little bit. It's like you just add it in, and it makes. I don't totally get it. I've not experienced it, but it's interesting concept. Um,
Psychedelic tofu. Love
yeah, somebody should
it.
make that website. Um, so I'm really curious about like mescaline, like phenethylamines, and like kind of perhaps why we haven't seen too many companies kind of looking at it. Like one theory I have about mescaline straight up is that it's kind of requires like a half-gram dose of the substance, and that feels a little iffy to me, at least in the recreational market. But I don't know. Have you all kind of looked much at the kind of mescaline specifically?
Yeah, we've done at least some preliminary looking at most well-known drugs, and it didn't pass our sort of literature screening as something that we wanted to try to work on. Our our team was of the view that there's other areas that we can focus on, and other molecules identified by Shulgin where we can apply the platform to, or some of the other design strategies to, where they think there's a greater opportunity for either novelty and hopefully differentiation.
Right. Yeah. I guess. Yeah, that makes sense. Like 2CB, for instance, I'm really excited to see some clinical literature on it once we get a little further down the pipes, because
Yeah,
it's
that's a
somewhat
really
related.
interesting one for sure.
Yeah, and 22
Yeah.
milligrams is plenty for most people relative to a half gram. So I think there's some serious benefit there. I was told by a quite famous underground chemist recently, it would cost about $20 to manufacture a dose of mescaline at scale, and that's perhaps why we never see it. Like it's something people want and fantasize about, but like it's just not there, and it's
Yeah.
all about like market forces, which is really interesting to me. Um, yeah.
That
So
is interesting. It's a great question. I have to go back to the team to because I
mm,
don't entirely recall why we passed on it, but yeah, that's a good question.
yeah, there's got to be so many reasons, right? Why you might do that versus why you might not do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I assume some of your criteria were like ease of manufacture, like different kinds of IP being available still, um, safety profile, probably comfort profile, honestly too, right?
Well, yeah, you said it, and the and some, we some classic molecules have really been already surrounded by lots of IP. So ketamine is all the derivatives of ketamine quite well covered. MDMA fairly similar. So um, we stayed away from those areas, but the view was psilocybin, lots of data around it, but still lots of opportunity. At least when we were back in early 2020, lots of opportunity still for related IP.
Right. So that makes sense. Yeah. So IP, since we're here, um, obviously a fun conversation, quite loaded with energy and excitement.
Yeah.
Sometimes for good reasons. Sometimes it's like we're being manipulated to not understand stories, I think. But,
Yeah.
you know, you've seen all this activity about some of the bigger actors in the space, maybe trying to do monopoly type moves for the whole field, or, stories are making it look that way. But based on what you've read, do you feel like hand holding in sessions and things like this are going to be, IP that you have to actually license from other groups? Um,
No.
those those kind of patents looked a little suspicious to me, and not really enforceable at all.
Yeah, I mean, just because a patent gets, I think one thing I've learned is that just because a patent is issued doesn't mean that it's would stand up to a review or be really enforceable in any way. And I think it yeah, the some of those patents around the therapeutic model are seem a bit obnoxious, but I wouldn't, and I realize they like provoke strong feelings, but I don't think anyone should spend a huge amount of time worrying about them, because I just don't think most of them are going to be enforceable in any way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
And
Us.
it's not that none of that would be an area where we would ever look to file applications on. Where folk yes.
Surefire way to get bad press.
Well, yeah,
Um,
I mean, we're really trying to patent legitimate advancements, and And I think, those who've tried to file applications on, formulations of psilocybin. I mean, if as psilocybin moves forward clinically, I think there's going to be a lot of competition, because notwithstanding the patent applications, it's in the public domain. So there are lots of participants in the pharmaceutical space that specialize in, formulating generic, off patent drugs, and I think that anyone who is relying on a patent around psilocybin is as their competitive barrier is going to be in for competition, and competition on price. So I think it's the simple corporate profit motive that pushed groups to file those applications. I just don't think I think pragmatically, it won't protect them. It's unlikely to protect psilocybin market participants from real competition.
Right. So you're actually in this arena in a sense, right? So there's things you've definitely looked at carefully. The formulation thing, I just want to get explicit about what that means. It's kind of like a particular packaged form of psilocybin plus other things like filler. Maybe the molecule looks like a particular shape.
Yeah.
Not filler, maybe active ingredients too.
Well, active
But
active active ingredient is really the way to put it. And so I'm not a chemist. I won't. I so
mhm.
I can only play in like basic analogies, but 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 I think the way to look at it is, um, trying to patent a formulation of a drug is really like trying to patent your own formulation of a Starbucks coffee, with your ratio of you could maybe get a patent on the exact ratio that you like of sweetener to dairy to coffee, but there's nothing to keep somebody from coming along and competing against you with the same coffee, so the same active ingredient, and just changing the proportion slightly or using slightly different versions of those dairy and sweetener. It doesn't really give you much in the way of protection.
Mm, right.
And that's what a formulation is. A formulation is about coming up with a ratio of different ingredients to the active pharmaceutical ingredient.
And I think this holds. So, the next level of paranoia comes from like when a Pfizer or like a really, top tier biotech scoops up one of these groups and, has a lot more legal firepower. Is it going to change? I don't really think so. I don't think a patent will hold up on psilocybin
I
or
don't.
hand holding.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that Mindset was the first group to announce a big pharma partnership, right, with Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. I think it is instructive that the first big pharma deal that got done in the space wasn't on psilocybin. Otsuka is actually a financial investor in Compass, but they don't have a strategic relationship with them, or commercial relationship with them. The big pharma has skipped right past psilocybin. Why? In my view, it would be because of the lack of strong IP rights. They've gone right to second, third generation drugs because they've made the assessment that even if you own the strongest IP in the psilocybin space, you're still quite exposed ultimately to competition from generic psilocybin, from physicians once psilocybin's approved, prescribing psilocybin, off label, just as you have with ketamine. So I think the yeah the and pharma knows this. They play this game over and over again. They don't want to start with a drug that's a generic drug. Drug categories end up being generic, but they want to start with drugs that have really strong IP rights.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Makes sense. And from my perspective, a lot of this kind of triggered responses maybe is from people expect that the substances that they know and love are going to have all sorts of weird copyright on them, like the same way when you buy a black market Gucci knockoff bag,
Right.
you might have additional penalties around copyright, and I don't really think that's a reasonable suspicion, unless you create some bioreactor that is generating a brand new patented molecule, like that might, but I kind of also doubt it, especially if you're doing it at small scale and not just like trying to sell it into markets as like a
Well, I doubt that any of this IP activity is going to change anything in the underground one bit. So if it's somebody who's has one foot in the underground and they're scared about what's going to happen to their magic mushrooms, I don't think that any of this has any relevance to it at all. The reality is that for psychedelic medication to be used on a wide scale, have physicians behind it. The natural product, is not going to work. It's not going to get through the FDA pathway. So it's got to be a synthetic, and it will more, I think, much more likely than not be a drug that is new and that has been optimized to some degree to be a bit safer and more predictable. So I understand people have emotional relationships with these molecules, substances, and I understand that to a lot of people pharma is a bad word coming from the culture, but this is how pharma is the way that the benefits of these chemicals will be experienced by the broadest possible group of people. And I don't think it's
right
going to change anyone's day to day.
right and I'm thinking about like the way I usually talk about this, like there's so many people that will never eat a mushroom, but if they get a
Yeah,
prescription in a clinical context and their trusted doctor approves of it, these people might also get healing.
exactly.
Yeah.
You've said it exactly. Would they be open to undergoing a psychedelic trip, knowing that this is in some way related to the mushroom that they've heard about, but actually it's had a lot of work done on it to make sure that it's predictable and it's safe, and their physician is bought off on it? Yeah, but are they going to, go? It's a much smaller group of people who will, if it ever becomes fully legal, go to a mushroom dispensary in the future down the road and buy a mushroom, capsule and do it at home or whatever. It's just a much smaller group. There's a much broader group of the world that wants the more more predictable medical system delivery.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's friend of mine's daughter. Trigger warning, everybody. Just tried to commit suicide the other day, was hospitalized,
Ugh.
and they're so interested. She thankfully is still alive. Smiles all around,
Yeah,
thank goodness. But
great.
there's massive amount of interest in like, how does somebody who's like, a public figure, this person's public figure, and like, how do they access this for their daughter who's 17 years old and has no, you know has all the resources a first world person might have, but not necessarily the ability to break the law or like go overseas for treatments, right? And it's, we need to make this stuff available ASAP. And I'm glad you people that in the pharma world are working on it on one path, and then others are working through protesting the DEA. Like, have you seen all the protests recently about the right to try stuff at the U.S. federal level? So like, somebody's going to die, and they want to relieve their existential angst.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah, and you'd hope there's some flexibility on that end. I'm really sorry to hear about your friend's
Thank you.
daughter, and I hope she's able to get better. It's yeah, even at Mindset, we get emails constantly from people who've come across us on the internet, and generally don't understand that we're not at a clinical stage. And these emails are all very similar, and each one of them really heartbreaking, because it's typically it's either the person themselves is really suffering, and a lot of them are from veterans, or it's written by a parent of a child who is gone through treatment after treatment, and nothing's worked, and they want to get access to a clinical trial. So we typically try to point them in the direction of the different groups that are running later stage trials. But yeah, the need is, I mean, yeah, we say it so often, but that doesn't make it any less true. Like the need for new treatments is so so profound, because look, the old treatments work for some people. They just don't work. They don't. There's a very large group of people for whom they don't work. So
Right. Or
I
maybe
don't
it
think that
works, but the side effects aren't great. So
or it
like,
works, but the side effects aren't great. And so I don't. I think psychedelic drugs won't necessarily, you won't have 100% of people suffering from depression using psychedelic medication, but I think in the future it'll be quite a significant number. And critically, there's a pretty significant number of people today who none of this, nothing works for, and yeah, it's really sad.
yeah. Um, are you, is Mindset largely doing phase 0 trials, or are you doing human trials yet?
None of our drugs are in human trials yet. We're likely going to get to that by the end of this year, early next year. Um, and both with some of the families that are part of our collaboration with Otsuka, and some of the other families as well. So I think we'll likely be in have more than one clinical trial underway pretty soon. Yeah.
Do you, so you have the pharma partnership with Asuka. Do you have any kind of university partnerships?
We don't at the moment. We are we're definitely, I can say, in discussions with a few different researchers at different academic and hospital groups. But yeah, most of the work that we've done, well, all of the work that we've done so far has been all our own internal work. We've got a close relationship with a group called Intervivo Solutions, which is a pretty well-known contract research business that specializes in predictive animal models for central nervous system drugs. But yeah, our whole focus from the beginning has been to own our own, our IP. It really, for us, kind of starts with IP, um, because that's what we figured would ultimately be, really the IP on second, third generation drugs would be really, valuable once the classic molecules get approved.
Right. And this is a long play. So a lot of people are, frustrated. They've bought all these, psychedelic stocks, and all of a sudden, they're not shooting to the moon within a month, and they're freaking out. But, I'm I've always been pretty clear. This is like a long game. You need some
Yes.
optimism in the market, but this is not a get rich quick in a month or two or 6 or even 12. Like, this is like a 3 to 7 year plan, right?
Yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, that is the nature of, first of all, that's not, unique to psychedelic drugs. That's the nature of biotech and pharma, is you have, pretty long, product development cycles to ultimately get a drug into to human use. And typically that those are long enough that they stretch across, multiple different, at least in, financial market, cycles. So you'll go through periods of, enthusiasm in biotech, and then, then less enthusiastic periods. And for investors who aren't used to that, it can be frustrating. I think, the good thing is that for all the companies is that, the work's happening, and as, more drugs get to the clinical stage, you're going to get more, and we're seeing this, more institutional investors coming to the space, because, typically, institutional investors, most big institutional investors, really don't get involved until with biotech companies until you're in, human trials, and then they're looking for, specific milestones and looking for drugs to progress. So I think, for, investors who were part of kind of the early, wild ride, and now are looking at, valuations that are down, I think, everything about the space that they liked before, if this is what motivated them, is only more so today. More good data, more trials moving forward, more, more research and attention on the space, and more serious biotech investors, looking at the space and figuring out how and when to get in. So, it's not cannabis, but it has every potential. That has all the potential to be, every bit as big, if not, bigger than cannabis. It's just, it's going to move at its own biotech, pace. So, um,
Right.
yeah, you're 100% right. It just requires a little bit more, patience, and just more focus on what the milestones are.
Right. Um, yeah, it's incredible just watching the whole kind of weird ride since, when was that? Early November, when the Compass results came out, and
Yeah.
everything seemed to take a nosedive, and it was fascinating to me. I thought it was kind of a weird reaction to, I thought, what was pretty good data. Could have been better data, but it was still pretty good. And um,
Yeah.
yeah, like, what happened there? And even like Midocin with the transdermal patches, like they've taken, which is going to be quite the interesting thing if that works out with their partnership with Hopkins. It's like that even took a massive nosedive. I'm like, what on earth? But, really, it's people just maybe starting to see a more realistic view of the timeline, and maybe they just wanted to get into get rich quick internet schemes and not like substance. But
I
I don't know.
Yeah, I think I think their share price had appreciated pretty well in advance of that announcement, and so I think there is there is an expression in biotech of, buy the rumor, sell the news. So you're going to have selling when news comes out, no matter what. But we thought it was really encouraging data, and anybody who we've spoken to who seriously spends time immersed in the space was of the same view. It was you're looking at a really chronically disabled patient population, where they were in that trial really doing kind of the least amount for them that you would do in terms of number of sessions and therapy around it. So we thought it was really encouraging, and to us, who are in the next generation business, we were like, this is great. This is the proof of concept that psilocybin, is statistically significant, and our goal is to try to do better, and it's a perfect proof of concept. So we didn't think it was a disappointment at all. Stock market reactions, you can never game this stuff out perfectly. It's
No,
its own animal. So
yeah, it's a rare person that even outperforms the market. So, you've got to
absolutely.
really, um, yeah. So, one kind of thing I wanted to bring up, and we kind of chatted about this earlier, and this is kind of why we're interested in novel compounds, Gen 2, etc. Have you heard of this thing called the Nagoya Protocol?
No.
The Americans didn't sign on to it, but I think a lot of other places did. The really interesting treaty, effectively, um, talking about like benefit sharing from think like the international treaty to solve biopiracy. Like, how do we get places that stewarded this stuff for centuries, if not longer, and how do we reward them a little bit, give them a little bit of a cut, make it seem a little bit more fair, which
Yeah.
is more relevant, I think, with psilocybin or iboga or ayahuasca, not so
Yeah.
much with like Gen 2 and beyond. Um, but it's still kind of an interesting question. There was, I don't know, like I don't know exactly where I land on it yet, but I do know that like we should try to be fair. Like look at the rubber trade and go
Yeah.
like we can do better than the rubber trade um, in the old days, and we are.
Yeah. 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 No disagreement here. I mean, I'm not, I'm not sure what the right solution is, but we should try to be fair. We're not here without the work that a lot of other cultures did in um, safeguarding and sort of shepherding these substances.
Right.
So
And a favorite topic on the show, coffee. Like there's a few places that have kind of stewarded this stuff, and you know, does Nestle care? Probably not. Bad example if I was looking for a caring corporation, but yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
yeah.
So I don't know. Like, are there any models you've seen for kind of private or public companies? Not going so far as maybe a B Corp, which I think is okay. It just seems like kind of a greenwashed model, maybe. But
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, what models for kind of leadership in this space have you seen that looked really good? Maybe we'll just say biotech specifically. Um, but I don't know. Maybe even elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't I can't honestly say I've seen any great examples, and it might be that I'm just not aware of them. That's totally possible, but
We're focusing on our businesses, right? It's kind of head down,
it's
so it's hard to look around sometimes.
yeah, especially with businesses that are, I think, in early stage development, where all you're doing is investing and spending. It's hard to think about, and that's the problem. It can be a bit hard to pay attention, devote enough mind share to that sort of stuff.
Right. And people might not understand this either, but it's pretty hard to run a business. It's probably even harder to run a public business. So, we try when we can. And, I think this is why we see a lot more like private philanthropic donations than perhaps straight from a corporate situation.
Yeah.
But, like Psychedelics today, Mindset Pharma, we're not like as profitable as a Pfizer or Genzyme or something yet.
Right.
Perhaps one day. But it's kind of, you got to have the roots first, and then you can start sharing some fruit later, if we want to use an agricultural analogy.
Yeah, I mean, of course, anything's possible. You can set a structure in place, from the beginning. It's just difficult to do that with, it's difficult to do that with all the priorities that you have trying to get a business, off the ground and get it as fast as you can, from being one where investors are going out of pocket to fund it, to something that's profitable. Which, again, in this case, in the case of biotech, is a pretty long time horizon. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, not a perfect excuse, but I think it's the reality.
Right. And we have to face reality quite plainly here. I know people, I get it too. I get a little fanatical once in a while. Um, but, we've got to look at the reality of the situation and kind of gauge like where should we go from here? Where can we go from here?
Yeah, agreed.
Who are allies and who aren't. And, I generally love that biotech is here pushing hard to help us flesh out our understanding of, receptors, drugs, substances, how does like different treatment models work, even like what might be better performing than others. Hamilton Morris was on stage at this Bicycle Day event the other day in San Francisco and said he's very happy that billionaires and millionaires are here helping fund psychedelic research. What a good problem to have. Even if you're a little paranoid, like it's amazing for science, right?
I think I mean, obviously, I'm of the same view. I think that the to go back to something I said before. Like I do think there is a potential for an even more exciting future for psychedelic medication that goes well beyond just the adoption of classic molecules. I think that there's lots of potential for more discovery work to try to create better and more precise drugs for a wider range of people in backgrounds, indications, and that really is where you need private for-profit investment to help drive that and create. Yes, you might be creating drugs that have, because of their novelty, may have strong IP rights. None of that necessarily means that classic drugs are off the table, and it's fantastic that classic drugs are what are really advanced in terms of clinical trials, because they'll be there and they'll be approved. But I think if there's a future where you have relatively low priced classic drugs potentially available, alongside more optimized, specific, drugs that have the full support of the medical community. I mean, what that would be a great place to get to. I think a really
I
great
think
place
so.
to get to,
Yeah.
and I think we only really get there with the machinery of capitalism moving forward.
What just to hit all the hot button issues, microdosing. So
Yeah.
so it looks like one of the things you're investigating acts like what we might want microdosing to look like. Could you? Yeah, I think it was on your site as like the phase 3 or family 3.
Family 3. Yes. So microdosing is really we're trying to come up with a better word for it, because it's probably not microdosing. But what we've seen with this family, is, which is, under the sort of the psilocybin structure umbrella, is, we still see some 2A receptor activity that looks like psilocybin at a sort of has a similar bell-shaped curve, but it's much gentler than psilocybin. This family is really early. It's not very far. I just have to caveat this. We're still very much in, preclinical, what you call, lead optimization, and identification. But it at a high level, we think it's a drug that's going to like activate some of the same receptors, but we don't think it will actually induce a hallucinogenic experience. But it also has a long duration. And so if you were looking for, there's a lot less hard data around microdosing. Lots of people who like to do it, but a lot less hard data around it. And in our minds, if you were to come up with a sort of an optimized medical version of a microdosing drug, it would be, rather than taking a small amount of a strong drug, you'd be taking a regular dose of a gentler drug that also had a long duration, so that the benefits of the drug, if they're there, last with you, throughout the day. So, and we think that there's all this early data around psilocybin and so many different indications, as you know. And we think that there'll be, even apart from what we think about when we think about microdosing, of like adults doing it for mood or creativity benefits. There could be population groups like children with ADHD, or older people with dementia, where like a sub hallucinogenic drug that has some of the same cognitive benefits could be really valuable. So that's what our focus is with that family. But again, it's much less developed than the other three.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting talk track, and I think it's something we need to talk about more. What treatments can we separate from this like high dose kind of psychedelic vision that a lot of people have? Like everybody needs to trip really hard. It's like, well, there's going to be a lot of conditions where you don't. There's going to be a lot of cases where you don't. And I love this microdosing talk track. And I think there's a lot of holes in the way the research is discussed too.
Yeah.
Opening room for pharma to actually look at it in a really cool way. So I'm excited about that. I love this idea of long lasting, but not necessarily kind of hallucinatory dose ranges.
Yeah.
I remember one group talking about cluster headaches, and I'm like, that's fascinating to not have to trip to cure that horrible pain. It's kind of a blessing. I'm sure many people would rather trip than have that pain, but if they had the benefit of not having to.
Yeah, there's a much larger group of people out there who will be more comfortable, not tripping than tripping. Question of whether they should trip is totally different, but like if this class of drugs works, it definitely opens up, I think, much bigger patient groups. But yeah, it's early. I mean, all the data is around tripping, not around not tripping. So like with so much else in the space, we need more data.
Yeah. We're fighting our way out of a $1 trillion war on drugs, and plenty of misinformation and decades of minimal, if not zero, research. So we're
Yeah.
at a disadvantage, but also an advantage, which is like great that you're out there doing this. So I'm thankful.
Yep.
Um,
Oh, very well
James, anything
said.
else we want to get into before we kind of wrap here?
Oh, I think this has been great. I think we've I think we've covered pretty much everything.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love it. Well,
Oh,
James Lanthier, I really appreciate you being here to represent Mindset Pharma, and hope we can do it again in the future.
anytime. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me, Joe. I really appreciate it.